Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Building a Family Business here on Builder Funnel Radio. As always, joined with Wes and Brooks. How's it going, fellas?
Going great.
Going great, Spence.
We were talking before we hit record, and I just got back from LA, and we were talking cars. It seems like down there, it's just it's another world. You know, every other car is. Well, I would guess 3 out of 4 cars is a luxury brand, and then maybe 1 out of 5 or 6 cars is like a cut above luxury brand. Yeah, Wes, you guys were talking about what is it, the gumball rally?
Yeah, we were talking about Gumball Rally, of course, back in the day in the 70s when that movie first came out, which kind of dates us a little bit, but loved that movie. But now I guess there's still guys and maybe gals out there still trying to break that gumball record. I think the most recent one was in the last, couple of months. Guy did it in under
Last month.
25 hours or maybe a little under 25 hours.
It was 25 plus, I think.
Yeah.
What was the record before?
It was in the 32s. It was 32 to 33, kind of standard. And then somebody else did it sub 30 a couple months ago during.
Like 28 something hours.
Yeah. And then, so this guy did it totally unsupported, because usually they run it with a blocker car and 2 or 3 people.
He had a lot of electronics, I think, that he put in it was a rental Mustang GT, and he bolted in all these extra gas tanks in the trunk and in the back seat, and then he basically, I think, brought along a bunch of pop bottles and everything else, so he wouldn't have to make as many rest stops.
Well, they usually have one like, tanker truck or a truck set up with, a couple hundred gallons of fuel. So they don't go to a gas station. They just they pull off at an exit, and they fill up, and then off they go again.
Okay.
So
anyway, it's crazy. That's pretty fast to get across the country, right? So was that 3,000 miles?
Yeah, it'd be like.
Let's just say it was 25 hours, 3,000.
Well, what's the start and finish?
That's averaging 120 miles per hour.
Yeah. Well, they start in New York City at the what's the garage they start?
Yeah, I forget the name of that garage, but there's the same garage that they all pull out of.
And then you finish at a hotel, and.
Isn't it down at the dock? I always thought it was at the dock or something.
No, there's a hotel lobby. There's a hotel they show. So you have to have a picture at the garage and a picture at the hotel, and then you have to document, and so you have to, submit your pictures and say, yeah, I did do this.
Crazy.
Pretty nice. And the other nutty thing that just saw some a video on was that, of course, heresy is that for the Mustang crowd, if people like Mustangs, is that Ford has kind of created a sub-brand for the Mustang, and they're having the Mustang Mach-E, which they've just, you can now place orders for, but it's a 4-door, with a hatch, and it's all electric. And so, the top of everyone's head is coming off because, oh my God, a 4-door Mustang. But they just came out with a demonstration drift model, and 1,400 horsepower. And so you go look for that video. It's just a bunch of tire smoke. So pretty crazy. They said it's like a magnetic roller coaster.
I've never been on a magnetic roller coaster.
I don't know. I've never been on a magnetic roller.
It just sounds wild, right? Yeah.
It does, yeah. Well,
the interesting thing is, if you're talking about Mustangs, a typical Mustang today GT, is 0 to 60 and in the 4-second range somewhere. And this Mach-E with 4 doors, the GT model that's coming out, will be sub 4, 0 to 60. So.
Yeah, and it would have to be to kind of compete, to compete with the Tesla.
Right, all the other electric cars, Tesla, right.
Yeah.
Anyway, sounds pretty cool.
And what do they want for that one, Wes? $100,000 or?
Oh, no. I think it'll be 50 something. So, Ford's always about affordability.
Yeah.
Relatively affordable.
Yeah, relatively affordable.
Yeah, because what's the Tesla equivalent, probably.
I don't know, but Tesla.
Probably 80 to 90 for apples to apples. So
Yeah, crazy.
crazy.
1,400 horsepower.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always like to
Any-
visualize that, just put all the horses, right there with the
all 1,400 horses right there. A lot of horses.
Yeah. Well, we could probably talk cars all day, or I say we, but you guys could, and I could watch you talk about cars.
Yeah, we should probably move on to something else.
Yeah. Maybe let's switch it up and talk leverage. That was something that we had talked about, I think, in one of our first couple of conversations. And we mentioned we wanted to circle back around to that, just because this tends to be a more levered business, or it can be, depending on how you grow your business. So I guess maybe, Wes, let's just start off with some initial thoughts around leverage generally. Like, how are you thinking about leverage? Why do you want to use it? And then we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. Well, if you think about just the very word leverage, which comes from lever, and why do we use levers? And we really use levers to multiply our effort. So, if you're going to move a boulder and, you need to move it, you can stick a lever under one end of it and put a fulcrum there, and then you can push down on it, and it allows you to magnify your weight so you can move the boulder, So it's really a way to get more work done faster. And so that's really what happens with leverage in a financial sense, is you are going to take what money you have and you're going to leverage it by borrowing more money to do a project, and that'll allow you to get a higher return on your amount of money. So typical example of, back in the 70s or 80s, maybe you're going to build a house for, let's just, for easy math, you're going to do $100,000 house. That's the sales price. And so you're going to buy a lot for $20,000 and build the house for $50,000. And maybe you have $10,000 in sales costs and soft costs, and you're going to make $20,000 in profit. Well, in the olden days of lending, you used to actually be able to borrow 80% of the value or the sales price of the house. So you could actually borrow from the bank $80,000 to do this project. Well, if you remember the numbers I just ran through, $20,000 was your profit. So all you're really deferring was your profit, and you're going to take that $80,000 and you're going to use that to buy the lot and build the house and sell it and pay the commission. And so it's almost a zero down deal. Now, obviously, to get a loan from a bank, you have to have some financial resources, and they're going to want to know that you have some cash on board and so on. But it's that simple idea of going, okay, I don't have a whole bunch of cash, but I can do this project and I can make $20,000 on the sale of this home, and maybe I've got a couple of grand into it. Well, that's leverage at its most simplest form, right? So now over time that has changed. So banks aren't going to loan you 100% of your hard costs. They'll loan you some, probably 80% of your 85% of your hard costs. So you are going to have some cash into the deal. So that's leverage. I mean, that's how you use it, and that's how you take a small amount of money and get larger returns, and allows you to move faster and do more work. Now, with that, there's certainly dangers, and I'm sure Brooks can talk a little bit about some of the dangers of leverage. Brooks, what are your thoughts on leverage?
Well, I believe there's no danger in leverage.
It's just all reward, no risk.
Yeah, it's all reward, no risk. And I have a phrase which probably is not allowed on the podcast, but it basically says, delevering is very painful. And
yeah, and how do you say that really?
And so
delevering the bitch.
Yeah. So really, and by deleveraging, so that's a pretty fancy phrase for what?
Pretty fancy phrase for, let's take your example, Wes, and say that you borrowed $80,000 and you're going to sell this house for $100,000 and profit. But there's some cost overruns, and now it costs you $85,000, so you're $5,000 short, and then the house doesn't sell for 3 or 4 months. You have to service the debt, and that takes another $5,000. So now two things have happened. You're down to $10,000 in profit, and if you didn't have that extra $10,000 in cash, the 5 for the overruns and the 5 for the interest, you had to borrow that from somewhere, or you had to not pay your vendors. And then the economy softens a little bit. The bank gets nervous and says, hey, we want you to put more cash into this project until you sell it. So they'll do a, what they call rebalancing of the loan. That's one of my favorite terms.
Let's just rebalance this up, right? Yeah.
Let's rebalance this up.
Or give me a bunch of cash.
Right. So why don't you put 20 grand in cash into this project, pay down the loan until you get it sold, so we feel better. So all of a sudden you went from having no cash into it to $10,000 plus another $20,000, and you've got $30,000 in cash into it, and you still haven't sold the house, and maybe you're going to make 10 grand now. So that's all fine if you had the 30 grand in cash. If you don't, that's the problem. That's the rub. And so that's where I say delevering, which is, rebalancing is really a tough situation, especially if you're kind of spread all over town with several different banks, and all the banks get nervous on the same day. And that's where people run into trouble with leverage.
Yeah, I think, so you can pretty much say that the higher your leverage, the higher the risk. So the more you leverage what you have, certainly if everything goes well, the better off you'll be, the faster you'll move. But the snapback on it can be really rough. So I think, that always begs the question, which is how much leverage should you really use? Because you can go from one extreme, which would be no leverage, which I only work with my own cash. And so that's one end. And then the other end is kind of what I described at the top of the program, which is 100% leverage. So that's the other end of the extreme. Yeah. Right. So that's the highest level of risk. So, what is the proper point of leverage? And that's probably going to vary for everybody listening to the program, depending on what their risk tolerance is, or what their spouse's risk tolerance is, or their partner's
risk tolerance.
Just think of it as,
Yeah. But there's industry.
We're talking about family business, and other people that their livelihoods are at stake as well. And then you also have to take into account, everyone has a risk profile, but you also have to look at it and go, okay, well, if this doesn't work out well, what are my moral obligations, to repay this money? Some people would say, well, you just declare bankruptcy and you just move on, and so, personally, I'm not a huge fan of that approach. I mean, it's, hey, you borrowed this money, you owe this money. So everyone is going to have a different approach to that as well. So all those things kind of have to be factored in.
There's certain things that, banks have certain guidelines, which you can use as a rule of thumb. And a lot of times banks will loan you for every $1 in cash you have, or $1 in equity, or your 401k, or whatever it might be. They might loan you $3. So a 3-to-1 ratio, they call it, or $5. Right before the downturn in 2008, I mean, banks were doing, 10-to-1. So the banks were really bullish on the home building business, and so they just pushed a ton of money out there. And go ahead.
No, what made me think of that, Brooks, was just, the 10-to-1 ratio. So we know how that turned out. Didn't turn out well for lenders.
Not for the 95% of the builders went out of business. No,
that's right. And it didn't work out for their lenders either, right? So, so I think the point is sometimes we think, well, just because the bank is willing to do this must be normal or
that's
okay.
Not right. Yeah.
But it isn't, because banks are made up of people, and those folks can bad decisions.
And they're trying to make a return also. They're trying to make a return for shareholders. So they have a mandate to, generate a return, and they may say, hey, we need to get as much return as possible. So we'll take on more risk. We as the borrowers think, well, if they're okay with it, it must be okay. And as we discovered, the banks are just as fallible as we are for making mistakes. I mean, I don't know if any of you guys have watched The Big Short with Steve Carell. That's just a perfect example of that whole situation where capital was chasing returns, and the people who got the most damaged were those consumers who didn't really understand what was going on, because they're like, well, the banks say it works, it must work. Somebody must be smarter than me. It turned out, 2 or 3 people were really smart, and the rest of us, were not.
Well, and I think that there's a difference too between smart and common sense.
Correct.
So, because as we saw with what caused the bubble back in 2008 with the tranching of debt and things like that, it's incredibly smart people thinking through that and how to do that, but common sense, not so much.
Well, you have to, you layer in greed. I mean, we all,
right.
Everybody wants to make a return and be profitable and have money so they can buy that car in LA that's like 3 steps up, right? And that's where you have to sit down when you're trying to figure out your own comfort level with leverage, which is, what am I willing to risk? Because most of us have to sign personally. Yeah.
So how do you figure that out if, you're, like you said, Brooks, you can use the bank as kind of a starting point, but we don't necessarily want to take that as the end all be all, I guess. What was your kind of personal, is there a multiple that you think about, like that 10-to-1 ratio or 5-to-1, or is it just situational?
It's interesting. The older I get, the more conservative I get. And I think, probably most people would say I'm still pretty willing to accept high levels of risk, but it's way less than it was, 30 years ago. But my risk tolerance is still way more than my wife's or my, our younger brother. So there's certain things you put in place by asking and collecting that information. I mean, some of the information, we're sharing now, which is, a ratio of 1 to 3 or 1 to 5, it goes back to, well, how much cash reserve should you have on board to run your company? So you have to decide, the industry standard would be like, oh, if you have 3 months of operating reserves, that you'll be fine. And turns out that's probably never enough. So is it 12 months of operating reserves? So there's different key points you have to ask yourself. What are the things you're comfortable with so you can sleep at night? And if you don't care about sleeping, then the numbers are much less. But if you're it's gonna stress you out. So you have to think about that, because the industry standard is just the industry standard, and it's just a guideline, and you can't take that as the gospel, because at the end of the day, most of us sign personally guaranteeing our loans. When the debt's due, they come looking at you, and that's it. So, and the bank will roll you up as quick as they'll roll anybody up.
I think you have to ask yourself a lot of what if questions. And sometimes, we forget to do that just because things have been going along in a particular way for a length of time. But and I think we're certainly seeing that now, of course, with the pandemic, which is going on as we record this podcast, and kind of the impact that's had on the economy. But of course, if you go back to February of this year, and now here we're sitting here in July, no one would have predicted or seen that. And so as you're thinking about your risk tolerance, you'd have to say, well, what happens if I can't sell this house for a year and a half? What happens? And so those things will start to suss out for you what your risk tolerance is, and also help you put some plans in place for different emergencies that could happen that, probably won't. For the most part, those things aren't going to happen. but if you've thought through those, at least you'll be able to sleep better at night, and because you'll know what your action plans are depending on how things go forward in your business. So I think doing those types of things can help you, feel a little calmer about using leverage, and maybe help you drive you to the right amount of leverage.
And also having those discussions with your partners, your business partners.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. Right.
As part of that conversation, so everybody's on the same page that says, okay, well, let's say everybody's in, they've contributed their capital, but you've had those discussions ahead of time. Which, yeah, what if we don't sell this house, or we have a renovation we're doing on spec and we don't sell it for 3 months or 2 months? What's our pricing strategy going to be? And really test those discussions, because you get 4 people in a room, and one person's going to be like, we're holding price until the cows come home, and another person's like, if we haven't sold it in a day, we're cutting the price to the bone and we're getting out. And it's somewhere in the middle, but we always had a pricing strategy approach to how are we going to move if the market changes, and not in a positive way, because you can always raise your price if the market's moving up. But if the market's contracting and there's less buyers, what is your strategy to get out ahead of everybody else? So we always had a strategy, which was, we want to be out of this market before it's all over, and there's 4 or 5 other guys sitting on spec houses or spec renovations, and they can't get rid of them, and they're going for 20% less than 3 or 4 months earlier. So our goal was to cut early, cut deep, and get ahead of it, so you're not chasing the market down. So we had some of these general strategies, and everybody was in agreement on it, and no one liked it when we had to do it, but we're like, yep, that's what we got to do. And so we did have a common agreement around kind of a general strategy, but it took a while to get to that.
I think that's a great comment, because we make a lot of assumptions about what other people think, what our partners think and our significant others think. And if you don't have that conversation, you won't find out until the rubber meets the road and you've got some sort of an issue or a problem. I think around, leverage and how much leverage really comes down to, if you do have partners, it's probably going to gravitate towards the partner who has the least amount of tolerance for risk. I would bet that's kind of where it's going to go.
Yep.
I think where you have to be comfortable, though, is that there's a wide range of risk tolerance within your partnerships, that probably the person who's the most risk tolerant is going to have to say, I'm going to have to be okay with that, and I'm not going to just hammer on the other person about, hey, we need to keep moving, we need to we need to do more, we need to go faster, and you got to have those conversations and figure out how that's going to work.
That's an unhealthy, it becomes an unhealthy relationship, because I had a friend of mine, and he was all leverage all day long, and he partnered up with another guy who was all cash all day long. It lasted like 18 months because they just approached things differently, and it was amicable, but it's just like, what, we are not on the same page. So it's a challenge in a family business, where you might be in a business with family members that you're not choosing by risk tolerance.
Sure, right.
So your spouse you didn't choose because of their risk tolerance.
That wasn't number one on the list. Yeah.
Hey, honey,
great personality, high risk tolerance.
Yeah.
Put that right in your online profile, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And same, Spence, for you. So you have cousins and aunts and uncles, and it wasn't all about risk tolerance. It's about the family ties there, and how do you. So it may be that in a family business around leverage and risk tolerance, you may do some projects with family members that are more conservative. And if you have a high need to be out there and roll the dice, you may just be doing that on your own or with other partners that meet that same risk profile. And that's just a way to deal with it. If someone's a real hard driver and they want to make a ton of money and take a lot of risk, probably not, it may not fit in that family business environment unless they're in charge, in control, and guaranteeing everything themselves. And then everybody else is like, oh, okay,
Yeah, and that is
one thing you have to think about, though, and I don't know, I haven't thought this through totally, but as you were saying that, Brooks, it made me think about if you say you have a high risk tolerance and you go out and do some things on your own and you're doing other things with other folks that have lower risk tolerance, you have to make sure that your projects that you are doing on your own can't come back and impact the other folks that maybe have a lower risk tolerance on those other projects. So there has to be some way to firewall between those projects, because that would be the worst if you were in partnership with somebody who had a high risk tolerance and they went out and did some other projects, and because they were not successful, that took your project down through no fault of your own.
Yeah, that goes back to guarantees and how you set those guarantees up, and that, you know, and it's pretty typical in partnerships where a partner is not allowed to pledge the assets of another partnership. You know, yeah, he can personally guarantee something, but the bank can only get to his personal assets, and there is that firewall that separates. So you have to be aware, if you have a high risk partner and they're out there doing a lot of stuff, that they may blow up, and they may not be there to support you in a downturn when there's a capital call and everybody's supposed to write a check for $100 grand. That partner's gone, and it's like, okay, how are we going to cover that? And so those can just be some, you know, frank discussions, because, you know, every partnership or LLC agreement, there's capital call, contributions, all those kinds of things that are in there. So running through those scenarios is always a little sobering when you're talking about doing a project. Say, okay, well, if this goes wrong and we have a rebalance and we have to all write a check for $100 grand, is everybody good with that? You look around the table, you know, and you can tell, oh, that, you know, that person's not good with that.
So Brooks, you know, as you think about it, how much liquidity, because that's really what this comes down to, you know, it comes down to liquidity, which how much cash do you have on board to service debt if you've leveraged up, and so how much liquidity do you think you should have in a business, or how would someone go about thinking about that?
I would go about, you know, probably if you're starting out and you have nothing to lose, you know, then I wouldn't have minded being 100% leveraged. Now, my wife would probably not agree with that, you know, but then as you get older, then we really use kind of the bank guidelines 1 to 3. We never went past 1 to 3. So, and even that became painful during the recession, and it turned out we should have been 1 to 2 or 1 to 1. And it's just really hard to grow your company being that conservative. So I think but I'd never go over 1 to 5 probably. And another way to do it is, like we've talked about before, get lines of credit set up on your houses. Give yourself some other ways to have capital, you know, if you need it, so that it doesn't have to be cash in the bank. It could be, well, I've got cash in the bank. If it gets really deep, I could draw my line of credit. And if it got really deep, I could draw against my 401k without closing it. You know, so those would kind of be the 3 buckets you would go to. And for us, we went into the recession. We had 2 years of overhead in the bank, cash in the bank. We burned through all of that, and we had both our houses paid off for both partners, and we drew those down 100%, and we made it. But it was 5 years of just, and we were making money, you know, trying to make money and dig our way out. But I think it took over $2 million to survive that, and then we had to start over. But we survived it and didn't have to declare bankruptcy. So I would say, it's that balance of how do you use leverage in a way to grow your company at a rate that'll meet your financial goals without going bust. And so, you know, 1 to 2 works, 1 to 3 works. Anything beyond that, I think you're taking some bigger chances, you know. So
it's kind of interesting hearing you guys talk about the balance of where you want to be for leverage or risk, and then you're thinking about your, say, business partner, but then typically or often both of those people have, you know, a spouse, and so, you know, I think a lot of times that person doesn't always make it into the equation, because oftentimes if you do have that setup, that person isn't necessarily a part of all the initial documentation or, officially part of the company or anything like that, but they are a part of the equation. And it almost feels like, as you think about it that way, whether the spouse is literally working in the business or if they're totally outside the business, you've got two people and that immediately goes to four people or potentially more, depending on how many partners are involved. If you're always kind of pushing towards the lower risk tolerance or, finding that somewhere in the middle, it should push you down, but that doesn't always happen. I
think it will. I think it will, because I just use an example, for us, Todd and his wife, Julie, they have different levels of risk tolerance to myself or my wife, Heather. And, I'm probably have the highest tolerance, and they all have lesser degrees of tolerance for risk. It's just a lot of discussions about, hey, what about this project, and what about, and even the lowest, there's probably, and I guess you could get someone who had no risk tolerance, and if in that situation, then that's probably just not going to work in a business that has risk, and so that might be the partnership doesn't work that way because there is one partner who doesn't want to take any risk. Well, you need to go work for the government or do something else, because this is not the business. You just can't do it that way here. I don't think so, but maybe I'm overthinking it.
No, I don't think so. And back to your point about discussions, Brooks, I think, if your spouse or your partner, let's say it's a non-working relative that's, but they're, it's your spouse. So they're involved in the business in the sense that they're signing documentation. So, but I think one of the things that happens sometimes with a spouse is they say, well, you're handling that. No, I trust you, go ahead. We're fine. You're telling me it's fine. And I think that's a super dangerous place to be. So I think, if you're listening to the podcast and your spouse is the one who's saying, hey, I don't, do what you want to do. I trust you to run the business and so on. I would push back on that person and say, no, you really do need to understand this, because if things go great, that's awesome. You're going to benefit. If things don't go well, you're going to be in the soup trying to help, work it out as well. So you really have to understand that. So I think, it's nice to have someone say, oh, whatever you say is great. But you don't want them to be there.
You want them to be
had implications for your relationship later.
You want to ask and say, hey, I want you to question down on these things, find out, question me about my assumptions. Let's try to make this a better deal. The deal may not go away, but it might be a better deal. And there are certain things you can do. You can limit exposure for the couple if it's a married couple, and only let's assume it's the husband who's in the construction business and building houses. Only the husband can guarantee, and the wife cannot guarantee. And you can put the house in the wife's name. And there's certain things you can do to, like to firewall those situations. But, out in the state of Washington, both spouses have to guarantee. So there's no really any way to separate. So you go back to Wes's example, which is, if you're signing a personal guarantee, you should know what the risk is, and ask those questions, and because you're both people are taking the risk.
Yeah.
One person's running it.
That's kind of how.
Don't let that other person off the hook by them saying, no, I don't need to read it. I don't need to know. You need to read it. You need to understand.
Yeah. Legal
documents. Everyone needs to be on board.
I remember having those discussions pretty early on with my wife, Rachel. She has a much lower risk tolerance than I do. And then I think the three of us have talked about, I'm probably even lower than both of you guys are. But we kind of gravitated more towards what she was comfortable with, because back to what you talked about, Brooks, was we both wanted to make sure everybody was sleeping well at night. Nobody was up worried about that or really nervous, and so we prioritized that, like happiness level or comfort level above like business goals, and speed, I guess, is more, you know, kind of the question, and how fast are you moving, and, you know, how hard are you charging in terms of that.
Right.
But it's been interesting. I think we gravitated that way. And then as we've got involved in more things, she's kind of pulled up, probably, if she were to look at her original risk tolerance, and then where she's at now, she's just more knowledgeable and more comfortable with what we're involved with. And I think it's primarily just hey, I haven't been exposed to this before, so I'm learning all of this. This is new. And then as you get comfortable with, you know, what's going on, then I think that helps you take on more risk. But in some ways it feels like less because of the knowledge, you know. And so I think there's that component too, is if you've got people that have really firm grasp of what the business is, where the levers are, where the risks are, and you've tried to mitigate those risks. If you compare it to somebody who, say, working for the government, we say, oh, that's the zero risk. Well, you might actually be in, you know, a less risk situation, controlling your own destiny with some quote unquote risk and leverage, but I don't know, you're just aware of it. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, the knowledge piece is huge. Obviously, the more you know, the more industry knowledge you have, all of that is what causes you to take the same situation, but view it as being less risky because of your knowledge base. And so if all things, you know, they say get understanding. So I think that's what you want to get in your business, is a true understanding. And if you understand it, then you understand what the pitfalls are, and you understand how to navigate those pitfalls, and you know what your options are. So that's a great example, Spencer. I mean, as Rachel's knowledge has come up in business, then she's like, okay, I understand that. So it's not as scary. You know, the unknown is scary, but if you know, that's not as scary, and you can put those plans in place.
Yeah. And we've spent a good chunk of time understanding, you know, what those worst case scenarios are, and kind of going back to what you guys were talking about in terms of liquidity, making sure we have really good runway in terms of what we're looking at. If something, you know, if a house wasn't rented for a while and you have to cover that, you know, the mortgage, how long could you cover it for? And, you know, those types of, you know, risks that you take on. But it kind of circles back around to, Brooks, you said, you know, if you're just starting out, you know, you'd be fine with 100% leverage, you know, pretty low to zero liquidity. But let's say for people listening, they got a fairly established business, maybe been in business 5, 10, 15 years, potentially more. And I mean, you guys had 2 years worth of operating expenses. I think a lot of people listening would go, holy shit, that's a lot. Like we don't have that much just sitting. Yeah.
It was a lot, and then it was gone.
And right. And that's the crazy part. Like the fact that you had built that up, I don't think you saw the crash coming, and maybe you did, but but I guess I'm curious to understand why you had built it up to that number, and would you recommend that number, or is there kind of a, you know, a different, you know, months worth of
probably, you know, a couple of mistakes we made. One, we had built it up because we had a rental portfolio that was cash flowing, and then as the market deteriorated, that rental portfolio stopped cash flowing and started to eat cash, and it ate cash at the same time our construction business was not generating cash. So our whole plan was like, well, the construction business will always make money. So mistake number one was to assume that the construction business will always make money. So I would go back to people, if they've been doing it for 10 or 15 years and they think, well, I've got this cash reserves, it's 6 months or it's a year. Just ask the questions, which are what if we didn't, you know, if we didn't make money for a year, how long could we last? Or let's say we've got a rental portfolio, we have 5 units, and let's say that, you know, 25% of the portfolio was vacant for a year. And some of these things you would think, oh, well, that'll never happen. Well, and here we are in the pandemic, and the government is mandating no evictions, and you're thinking, I never would have thought that would have ever happened, and here we are. So you ask those crazy questions, and then come up with what you're comfortable with, and you're going to be probably close to right. And your goal is, at the end of the day, if you just want to survive whatever the economic upheaval is, so you can, live to fight another day and make another dollar. And I think that's if you save more, it goes back to that fortress balance sheet idea we talked about, which is just having a lot of cash on board is never a bad idea. So, but if you use those standards of, a 1-to-3 ratio or a 1-to-5 ratio for borrowing, and what are my different firewalls for how much money I have, what I have available, so that's that idea of, if you can pay your house off and have a line of credit, then you've got another resource without having to have that, cash sitting in the bank or something. So, or you could pay off a rental and have a line of credit on that. So different ways to have different reserves.
Yeah, as I'm listening to you say that, Brooks, so I think one thing I would say about the lines of credit, say on your house or other assets, I know back in the 07-08 downturn, I knew several folks here in town that had different types of businesses. One was an HVAC company, and so on. So he had a line of credit that he used, and you need to read the fine print on your lines of credit pretty carefully. So he relayed the story of he was out golfing with his banker, and about hole number 7, and the banker said, "Oh, by the way, we're going to call your line of credit." And he's like, "Well, wait a second. There wasn't anything wrong with this business.
Nope.
It was just fine." But the bank had kind of freaked out by what was going on in the marketplace. And so they were going around and yanking lines of credit. So I would say grade your liquidity options. Obviously, cash in the bank is most liquid, and that's number one. And then you could go to maybe, stocks and bonds. Those are fairly liquid. There's a big market for those, but the value can go up and down. And as we've just seen in this most recent downturn, so, you might see a 30 or 40% drop in the value of that portfolio. So you have to recognize that could plummet even though it's liquid. And then maybe after that, it's lines of credit, but recognizing that those lines of credits could be pulled. So you kind of have to grade your liquidity, I think, and go, okay, well, what are the odds of that, and what would happen if this?
And you have to be ahead of your lenders, and not in a bad way, but just be thinking, okay, what am I hearing in the news? What am I hearing? What's going on? Because when the downturn started, for us, we drew down all of our lines of credit, took the money, put it in a different bank. And so then you have to spread your money around depending who you're borrowing from, and just protect yourself. And so we did that. So if they had closed our lines of credit, we would have just said, well, okay, well, let's figure out how we're going to repay you, but we've got the cash. And so that's where in that situation you gave Wes is, if he had pulled down his line of credit, because he's thinking, he wouldn't have even thought of that, because he's like, my business is doing fine. But it's what's going on in the whole economy, what's going on, in the banking world, what kind of banking pressures are. I had another friend who had a guarantee on a $50 million loan with some other partners. They were rock solid. The bank during the downturn needed the money. So the bank, crunched on them and said, hey, we want you to pay this off because you're out of compliance for some reason. And so they had to, work their way through that. But it wasn't because of the project or because of the guarantors. It was because the bank was under pressure and the bank needed liquidity. That's
right. So I think if you're working with a bank, most likely you are, if you're working with a bank, then I think that's where the level of communication has to be high at all times. So, even if your bank doesn't reach out to you very often, you need to reach out to your bank, develop some relationships within the bank. So you have some folks that you can take to breakfast or lunch and find out how things are going for the bank, and you can relay how things are going for you. And so you have that dialogue. So when you need to talk to somebody, you can talk to somebody. And that's where I always, and this is just personal preference and it's going to be different for everyone, but that's why I like to work with smaller banks, local banks, that at least you can develop some sort of a personal relationship, so they understand where you are coming from, and that you are a good risk, you know.
And smaller banks are going to be more motivated to work with you because they don't want to take the write-off. You know, if you borrowed $1 million from a small bank, they're going to like, hey, we'd like to get that money back. If you borrowed $1 million from Bank of America, whatever, they don't care. They'll wrap you up. And so I think that's a good point. Do remember that banks are, they're very friendly, but when it comes time to roll you up, that loan officer disappears and you get, you're into special credits and it's a whole different relationship. So, it's a nice relationship. Yeah, they'll take you golfing. They'll,
Right.
But that person's gone. And
but I think that's, Brooks, where you want to work as high up in the bank as you possibly can.
Absolutely.
So you want to be talking to, if you can, be talking to the bank president.
That'd be ideal.
That's the person you want to be talking to. If you're talking to VP level, there's usually like 9,000 VPs.
9,000.
In the banking industry, everyone gets to be a VP. Yeah. It just helps on the sales side. So.
Right. So I think that's a very valid point. And that did help us during the downturn a little bit because we little bit. It might have because things got so bad then for everybody. It ended up, not.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm not saying that's but at least it's a little something where
it'll buy you some time. It'll buy you some time. Exactly. Where they're gonna like, well, okay, we've been banking with them for 30, 40 years. We'll give them a little more runway. We'll try to, we'll wrap up some other people first before we get to them. But in the recession of 08, 09, it got so bad for so long. Eventually, they get to you. But that's okay. I mean, that it gives you more time to try to figure it out.
And that's what you need at that point. You need that time. Well, we're digging into some pretty good stuff here, and I want to dive deeper into this fortress balance sheet concept, but I know you guys have a hard stop coming up, so I think we'll say that for next week. But I think this whole concept of, how much liquidity, what does that balance sheet look like, the different grades of liquidity, I think we were getting into that a little bit, so maybe we can do a deep dive next time. But any final thoughts on leverage and liquidity as we wrap up this conversation? Wes, anything you'd leave everyone with?
Always cash is king, and it's great if you can work from an all cash position and don't have any lenders. That ultimately that's the greatest place to be. And so if you can get there, or if it makes you feel comfortable and you want to go slower and do it that way, that's not a bad standpoint. Then you can just ignore this entire conversation.
Well, yeah, for sure. And I'm sorry I was distracted. There was this huge hawk just landed on the right outside my window that's looking to feast on some birds on my bird feeder. So yeah, pretty funny. But speaking of hawks, I would say, yeah, you can be cash, but that's not realistic for most of us. That's maybe 1 out of 100. So have those discussions with your partners. Just grab lunch and just sit down and just talk about it. Talk about, hey, how were you raised? How did you discuss risk and cash flow and money at your table when you were a kid? How does that affect how you think about it now? And it's an interesting conversation, and it'll get you closer to then when you're looking at projects and talking about it. Where is everybody at, and what is the right position you want to get into as a business and personally? And I think if it's more collaborative, you get there quicker, and you don't spend a lot of time trying to do projects together that maybe you shouldn't be trying to do together because of very, very risk tolerances.
Yeah. Good advice. Well, thanks guys for sharing your thoughts, and for everybody listening. Hopefully you've probably identified it by now. We don't have all the magic answers. We just give you good ways to think through everything. But I think, as with all things in business, and especially family business, there are so many factors and personalities, and you do have to take those into consideration. So it's hard to say, yes, you should do X, and that's the only right answer. And so hopefully what these conversations do for you guys, just give you another way to think about it, some new lenses to look through, and make a good decision for your situation. So we appreciate you guys listening. If you're enjoying the show, please share it with a friend or a colleague, and go ahead and leave us a review over on iTunes. And we'll see you next week here on Building a Family Business on Builder Funnel Radio.